First, welcome to you, Albany, and congratulations on the success of your first novel. For this conversation, I'm hoping we can cover a little bit about your personal journey into writing, why you decided to write this book, and also get into a little bit of the background and reasons for the stories that you chose to write. So you have a very beautiful way of writing, and for those who haven't read the book, you will see that. But let's start off with a simple question. How did you get into writing?
Well, good evening, first of all. I'm so happy to be here tonight. And I wanted to take an opportunity to just say how kind this community has been toward me. I am so appreciative and so filled up with warm fuzzies after an afternoon spent with the students here. It's just been lovely. I'm very happy to be speaking with you tonight. How did I become a writer, essentially? I think it's a confluence of factors. I think, first of all, personality predisposes us to career, I think, and profoundly introverted, but also someone that my strengths come forward in art. I have always just had a mind for creativity and that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I just felt this dearth in my life, that there were these stories that were not being told, reflecting my experiences. And after a while, if you have had the experience of feeling represented in art, you may not know that longing that someone can have of just wanting to see your reflection in the world. I think some people achieve that through having children. And in my case, I've never wanted to be a parent, ever in my life. That was never a longing of mine. But I did want to create some art to reflect my experience. And I think those things are ultimately what turned me into a writer.
Well, your writing is beautiful, and you did create something very wonderful that's been well received, and we'll get a little bit more into the reception about that. But as someone who is not familiar with the Nation of Islam, I was afraid I might not fully grasp the significance of some of the stories. And I had to do a little research because I wanted to make sure that I was understanding, for the most part, the stories. And you did a really good job of making this book for people of all audiences, whether they had a background in it or not, with the cultural significance. But Temple Folk is about a specific history and a specific lineage, African-American Muslims who came into Islam by the way of the Nation of Islam, correct? Yeah. And can you just, as simply as you can, briefly explain some of that history of this specific group and how that history is woven into this book?
Well, I think most people in this day and age are familiar with the contemporary nation, which is Louis Farrakhan's movement. This book does not really address that version, that iteration of the Nation of Islam at all, except very, very briefly in the third story in the collection, The Spider, and it's only touched upon very lightly. This book is really about a community of African-American Muslims who were associated or members of Malcolm's Nation. So they were members in the 60s and 70s, and they left when the nation sort of disintegrated in 1975 and became a Sunni movement. And so the contemporary nation is resuscitated in 1981. It died in 75. So there are three distinct phases in this organization. I don't know that everybody knows that. And so the stories, I should say, take place mostly within the Sunni context. However, the atmosphere is shaped by this past where the people were members of the Nation of Islam, and it has a lot to do with how they understand their relationship with Sunni Islam.
Perfect. Now, in these 10 stories, you talk about the struggles around faith, sexuality, ethics, and moral relations. You know, in writing about a topic so close to you, especially one that's part of your own family history, were there any internal pressures to portray a certain way, or what was it like to write about something so personal, and how you want it to, since there weren't, as you said, many stories about that reflective of your own personal experience, what was it like to put that down on paper and portray it in a certain way?
That's really interesting, because my writing perspective began to strengthen the more estranged I became from my faith community. When I was very practicing and wearing hijab every day, making my 5 times prayers, I'd had this aspiration to write, and I wanted to write specifically from the point of view of someone who would depict this world in the most flattering way. Mm-hmm. Muslim women cover, and we're all happy covering, and I just wanted to portray this world in the least critical, most uplifting in my concept at the time kind of way. But my writing was improving the farther away as I was backing away, I should say, from the faith. And oddly enough, everybody in my faith community is really embracing temple folk, even though it's quite critical of that world in a certain sense. I think it's a loving collection. I think that love is infused in all of the stories. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, people from the faith community, I should say, seem to pick that up, that it's possible to have a critical stance, mm-hmm. but also to understand, or for the writing to convey a sense of love, mm-hmm. And that's life, that's storytelling, It's not a good story if there isn't a mixture of all of that happening.
Yeah. And you also incorporate, I noticed, a bit of humor into your stories too. And when we think about sometimes talking about religion or faith, we don't always associate humor. So why did you choose to incorporate that into your writing?
It wasn't a choice. I really do see a writing life as an extension of personality, and we don't really get to, I guess some people can pretend, but we don't really get to choose our personalities, and in that way, I don't feel like I'm choosing to be funny on the page. Mm-hmm. It's the one area of my life where I am funny. I'm very, very serious most of the time. But I like to laugh when I can, and somehow I have this ability to be funny on the page, and I take every opportunity I can to insert a joke or have. What I do typically is I make the tertiary characters do something kind of outrageous. I just love inserting someone who just is just odd in the frame, why is she doing that? And why are you even here? So that's how I insert humor. But it's just the way I write. I can't help it.
As we're talking about your writing and these 10 stories, would we be able to hear a sample of your work, maybe about for 10 minutes or so, just a section of your reading?
I'm happy to read. I will read a section from the story, if you have a copy, a section from the story, Sister Rose. Sister Rose. Sister Rose. When Intisar was small, she imagined that Sister Rose made her home in a mist of clouds, enveloped all day in ethereal rays of light. She thought so because of the way Sister Rose seemed to float underneath her long abayas across the musalla floor to the spot where she and 5 or so other little girls would gather for her Sunday school lessons. What else could explain her litheness, her sunset peach skin, the way her irises sent threads of gold bounding out from the pupils like a million solar flares? So that 20 years later, long after passing through disillusion with the temple folk, Intisar was almost shocked to behold Sister Rose's actual residence. It was a little bungalow with glossy black shutters, a white picket fence, and a neatly manicured lawn, lovely in its own way, save the spring rains that turned the day dreary and made all the white faces of the daffodils lining the front walkway droop to the ground. On her knocking, Brother Mujahid, Sister Rose's husband, appeared behind the screen door in a long white thobe. Of an instant, the pages of Intisar's memory flipped from the tall, strapping, burnt sienna men she recalled to the one that stood before her, more stooped than she remembered, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair and a faint smile that failed to betray his weathered countenance. "Now look who it is after all this time," he said. "Assalamu alaikum, little sister." Intisar bowed at his greeting. It was all she could do to distract from the way that her tongue had grown unaccustomed to the use of such phrases, Masha'Allah, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah. Instead, she raised a gift to his view, and Brother Mujahid's eyes widened. "Ah," he said, "you really shouldn't have done this." It may very well have been his own surprise that upset his expression, though Intisar immediately began to second-guess herself. "You should have just given the salams," she thought. "You should have covered your hair and worn something that did not expose the bottom half of your legs." He led Intisar to the living room couch and set the gift down on the lazy boy opposite her before disappearing into the back of the house. He made tinkling sounds with cups and plates in the kitchen, but otherwise the house was still. Intisar might have sat contemplating the seriousness of her visit and the fact that she was going to see Sister Rose, the woman she loved best at the temple, for the first time in 20 years. But she felt inundated by different thoughts. The living room was discomfortingly familiar. On the east-facing wall, there was a large photograph of white-clad worshippers making tawaf around the Kaaba. A Hafiz trained in Senegal, Brother Mujahid had lined the opposite wall with hundreds of volumes of tafsir and other titles like How to Believe and The Walk of the Sahaba. Intisar was still scanning the room as he re-emerged with mismatched mugs of peppermint tea and a tray of almonds and dried apricots for them to share. "Please enjoy this while you wait," Brother Mujahid said as he sat in the lazy boy. "It should only be a few more minutes before you can go back." He released the chair latch and it sent his legs up, exposing the pale, yellow undersides of his feet. "Your father has been telling me all about the things you're doing with yourself. It's been a couple of weeks since I last saw him at the temple. How is he doing?" Intisar lied, telling Brother Mujahid that her father was fine. She didn't let on that aside from an occasional phone call, the two of them barely spoke, and she was grateful that he carried on talking and didn't ask her to elaborate. I would tell my wife all about it, and it made her so happy, like it was her traveling all over the world. Intisar smiled into her mug, Brother Mujahid's praise, offering a silhouette of pleasure. "Your pops told me that recently you were in New Zealand and Japan. I know that had to be the experience of a lifetime," he said, tilting the golden head of a honey bear upside down, a slow stream flowing into his tea. "You gotta do all you can in this life, while you can, you know." "Yes, sir," Intisar said. "I'm just trying to make a way in the world." Brother Mujahid might have thought it immodest had she gone on. It was at the temple, after all, where she learned the idea that pride, so necessary in the constitution of a man, was unbecoming in a woman. Before the awkwardness could settle, he picked up the box and examined all its sides, admiring the silver wrapping and white ribbon, which Intisar had carefully tied hours earlier. He tore the paper open and marveled at the contents. "Wow, now this looks fancy," he said, turning it over from side to side. "You mind telling me what it is?" The problem of what to get Brother Mujahid and Sister Rose had been as burdensome as the idea of her visit, considering the circumstances. Any of the obvious choices, flowers or a teddy bear, seemed to her ill-suited and laden with upsetting inferences. And so she settled on the most innocuous gift she could think of, a work of modern art. It was a small sculpture she found at a favorite gallery downtown, a solid stone of white marble, mostly round, but jutting in places with a few holes poking through. "It's a Greg Mantis piece. You should look him up," she said. "As far as what it means, I'm sure he'd say it's all in the eye of the beholder." "It looks to me," he said, narrowing his eyes, manipulating the sculpture from one side to the other, "like somebody that got in a bad fight and lost an eye." He was about to offer another idea when an older, very stout woman in a sweatsuit with short, strawberry blonde hair emerged from the back hallway and said, "You can come this way. She's ready to see you now." Intisar stood, the nerves tingling her spine like a million little ants traipsing up and down her back. She passed through a dark hallway toward an open door which spilled forth a silvery light. She turned the corner, and there was Sister Rose. She sat near the window in a rocking chair amid an assortment of plants so numerous that despite the hospital bed in the middle of the room, the space looked almost like a nursery. Sister Rose smiled, raising her hands from under the granny square blanket on her lap, welcoming a hug. "Inti," she said, bright but gravelly. "It's so wonderful to see you after so long." Intisar smiled uneasily. When she first saw her, Intisar tried to disguise her alarm at Sister Rose's appearance. She was starvation thin, and her skin, once a glowing and vibrant peach color, had turned sallow and dull. Her eyes, the feature that had most fascinated Intisar so many years before, bulged in a way that turned her gaze from soft and approving to penetrating and serious. I'll stop there.
I think we could all agree your way of writing is absolutely beautiful. Do you have a favorite? There's these collection of stories, each one sort of a different topic. Did you have one that was a favorite to write, or one that was just hard to write because of the topic area? Or what was the process going through and collecting, or figuring out what you wanted to include in this book?
My favorite story to write, all of them were so special. I enjoyed writing The Spider a lot because it's a funny story. And again, I was so impressed with myself. I said, oh my gosh, it's funny. And I wrote it. And it's really funny. Oh gosh, I really have a lot of hang-ups around being unfunny. And so I was really proud of myself. I was like watching myself write it, like, yeah. I loved writing Sister Rose because that story really resonates with me very deeply. I had an amazing experience writing Due North. There's a whole story there. But the hardest story to write was Janaza, because at the time that I was writing it, I was teaching myself how to write men in a way that was convincing to me. I don't know that other people are persuaded that my men are men, but I feel confident that they're fictional men, at least, And so I took my time with that story, just trying to really uncover some foundational principles, at least when it came to approaching these characters, of what makes a literary man, what makes a man on the page. And that was a very, very long process. It's one of the shorter stories, but it took the longest to write. One of the fastest stories in the book is the longest story, Due North. I wrote it in a week and a half.
Wow.
But yeah, Janaza, for whatever reason, took forever. Yeah. But I'm very proud. It's one of my favorite stories in the book.
Now, I know you said that you wanted to write this because you wanted more, see more representation, like you wanted to include these stories from that personal experience. But did you ever see yourself in this first novel, like taking on, that's a big thing to write something so personal. Did you ever think this would be your first type of novel, or did you want to start with something else, or how did it come about where this came about? The Temple Folk coming about, the publication of any book is really about a team effort. I think this book wouldn't exist if, I do not have a typical publishing story. I've told the story so many times, I don't think you want me to repeat it. But I really do feel, and I don't want to weird anybody out, I'm very, very affirming of those of us who do not perceive divinity in the universe. And I don't want to alienate you by saying this, but I really do feel like a divine presence in this whole project. Again, like I don't want to offend you if you are not on that God stuff. But yeah, I knew it was going to be a collection, whether or not it was in the world or not, because I was doing this work. I was teaching myself how to write, and my preferred form is the short story. It's so rigorous and it's so demanding. It is so hard to do, and I love it. It's like a very, very intricate math problem, very intricate. I love that about short stories. So if I was going to write anything, it would be that. And the other thing that I appreciate about this my first effort being a collection of stories,
relate to the unprecedented nature of the subject matter. It gives the reader a survey of an entire world from various vantage points, so that you can walk away from this book, feeling like, you know what, I can see it from, a variety of angles, and it gives me a sense of a complete community as opposed to one life and one family. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned teaching yourself how to write. Can you go on a little bit about that? Like, this is something that you just came about wanting to write, and you sort of taught yourself, or go into a little bit about that process.
Discovering my writing identity has been a lifelong unfolding. There have just been so many, looking back on this, I can see the design. But at the time, I was just a tormented young person, really unsure of what I was going to do with my life. But there were these little things, and when I was young, I have beautiful penmanship. I love my penmanship to this day. I know kids don't read cursive anymore, but I've always had beautiful penmanship, and I loved writing just to see it. And as a teenager, I won every essay. Like, these are the kinds of things that happen. But the creative writing came when I started appreciating how dexterous my mind was. I just had a very flexible mind. I could take an idea and bend it, and I just want to chew the ideas. I love it. I love creating.
Yeah.
And I need to write. I have a need to do it. I don't know how anybody does this work if you're not hungry for it. It's too hard.
Well, I think that comes across in your writing. Just even when you're reading up there, the passion that you have, it's expressed. So
yeah, I needed this book. I needed it for myself. And because, again, I don't have an MFA, I had no publishing connections. I came to a point in my writing life where I was just certain that the work would never see the light of day. But I needed the story so much because it grounded me. It gave me a sense that I existed in the world. And it's so amazing how some of us really need art for that. It gives us a sense of presence in the world. Without this book, I feel like a non-presence. So I needed the book. And it's just a very happy outcome that it's now available for everyone.
Not only available, but it's been very successful. Are you? It's so well written that I'm sure it's not surprising. But were you surprised at the positive reception and how many people really from all different walks of life kind of read this book and connected with it?
Thank you for that very flattering portrayal. That's not my sense. I don't have this sense of positive reception. I think it's been quite mixed. That's just my sense, and I think part of it is because I'm aware of the sensitivities people who don't know this world, the sensitivities that they bring to a book like this, and how hard it is for people to overcome the book's attempt to humanize a religious community that in this country we are taught to look down upon because of the ways we presume they look down upon us. And so, yeah, I don't have a perception of the book as having been positive, of there being a universally positive reception around the book. I'm grateful for the pockets of understanding and community that I have been able to form around the book, but it's like there's an oasis here and an oasis there.
But that's like for a book like this brings, I'm a social worker, and you need a book like this to help create that understanding. And you said there's pockets of people who might not understand or that might not be received, but it needs to be out there, and that story needs to be told. And that's, whether they appreciate it or not, it needs to be there, and you were responsible for bringing that. And I think that alone is something. Somebody can pick up this book and relate to it. And that alone is something that's really powerful to have. So I think that's an important contribution to this writing world, whether it's universally accepted or not. Having this here is critical.
Thank you. I mean, don't please don't get me wrong. I am not someone who's lacking in confidence. I feel the work is worthy. And so when I got the long list for the National Book Award, I screamed. My editor told me, "Girl, you screamed like I killed your mother." I was so happy. And when I got the short list, okay, that's a story. Can I tell you the story?
Yeah.
So the announcement was going to come out this one day. The day before, I was so nervous. So I sit down, I turn on Netflix, and I'm watching the series Who Killed Malcolm X. Have you guys seen that? It was so well done. And I just wanted to be in the world, you know. I just wanted to be surrounded by these ideas in a way to sort of calm my nerves and just affirm myself. So I get this phone call. Actually, I don't think I'm supposed to say that. I'm sorry. I got the news that I made the short list. And when the person told me, I cried. And I'm not a crier. I cry once a year. I don't know if I cry. Yeah, I cry once or twice a year. It happens very rarely. But my publication story was just so dramatic and traumatic. All of those memories were coming back in that moment. And I just felt, heavens, it was all worth it, you know? And so, yeah, it was an amazing experience, but one I felt I deserved. I personally think Temple Folk is excellent. I think it will stand the test of time. I think it's lovely. I think it's rigorous. I think it's approachable. And it's there to be a friend. It's a book that can be a friend, you know? So, yeah.
It's excellent. I have some more questions, but I want to see if anyone in the audience has some questions, because I would love to hear, you know, not me talking. Go ahead.
Bring you a microphone.
There's a microphone
Sorry.
coming to you.
Hold on.
Here's a mic coming.
Have you reach over to us? Lean forward.
I noticed that I couldn't tell you were of the Islamic faith by sight. And it's one of the questions I have for you is that oftentimes the Islam is thoroughly laced with the Arab culture, and many of the things get confused by imposing what Islam's Arab culture says and what the Quran says. Have you made a conscious decision to follow what the Quran says and not necessarily what the Arab culture requires?
I'm going to answer that question putting myself in the frame of someone who's practicing, because I don't really perceive myself as a practicing Muslim. I feel like I'm more culturally Muslim at this point. But when I was in those spaces, that kind of concern is certainly a part of a Black Muslim experience, because there is this gaze upon African American Muslims that is always questioning the legitimacy of our expression of Islam. And that gaze imposes a particular Salafi, very strict, you could say, version of Sunni Islam onto us, so that you're in the masjid, for instance, and someone who's not African American comes into the masjid and they disagree with the way that we form the prayer lines, and they say, "La, brother, la, astaghfirullah, you need to reconfigure these lines." We get a lot of criticism like that, and it was something that angered me, because I felt, you may feel comfortable doing that here, but are you going to the Sufi masjid and telling them they shouldn't sing their chants? Do you go to the Shia masjid and tell them they shouldn't worship saints? There's so much diversity in the Muslim world, and there's some people who get targeted for religious innovation or bid'ah more than other populations. And it's just very curious, not curious, I think we all can understand why that happens to African American Muslims more than other kinds of Muslims. But that's a choice that people make, and it's something that a lot of us just reject. We reject that because it's and that's all religion. It's all a kind of imperialism. And in like a liberation context, you don't get to tell me how I observe this faith because it's subjective. It's a text. This is not mathematics where the values are understood and fixed across culture. No, culture makes things malleable. Everything is changing and dynamic. And so don't expect me to do something you wouldn't expect someone else to do. It's religion. It's a human technology. So I hope that answers your question, sir. I tried my best.
Was there another hand raised? Or Alyssa can ask another question. You can keep formulating.
Oh, I see a question over here.
Okay. You had a question.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the epigram and how you kind of came up with that particular section or verse, and how that connects perhaps to the rest of the book, which I haven't read yet?
Thank you so much. Thank you for that question. I've wanted to address this. There's a story there too. Shall I tell you the whole story? So I originally chose a Diggable Planets lyric for the epigraph. I love Diggable Planets. That's my... I'm sorry? Oh, sure. So the epigraph of the book, of the advanced reader copy, which is the version of the book that is not available for sale, but it was just distributed in some circles, was Projects, Tenements, Pyramids, which is a lyric from a Diggable Planets song, Where I'm From. And that lyric, to me, was so evocative of the world of temple folk because this is an African-American working class urban community, right? So projects, tenements, that's where we live. But mentally, we're in the pyramids. We may be physically confined to this environment, but our consciousness is expanded beyond where we live. And so I just thought, like, that's really temple folk, come on now. But my agent told me, he said, change it. We can't afford it. It's going to be prohibitively expensive for us to include that as your epigraph. And so I settled on this verse of Quran, and you wanted me to read it. Do you want me to read it?
Straight out that back door.
Yeah, it is He who made the stars as your guide through the darkness of land and sea. So that is the epigraph of this version of Temple Folk. And I chose it because the book evokes the cosmic. And there are lots of points in the book where there are these cosmic phenomena that are inserted. It just happens constantly because, and that's intentional. When we make the communal prayer and we pray Al-Fatiha, which is the opening surah of the Quran, we pray Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Praise be to God, the guardian, sustainer, and evolver, the cherisher and sustainer of the universe. And so when I would pray that prayer as a child, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, our eyes would be closed and I would see stars and galaxies swirling in my mind. I always felt that Islam was a religion that allowed us to contemplate our place not just on this terrestrial plane, but to examine our place in the universe. And I thought one of the ways I was able to create an Islamic atmosphere in the book was to evoke the cosmic. And that's why I chose that verse, "It is he who put the stars in the sky as your guide," also because the book is really a contemplation of Islam and its place in a conversation about African Americans and our constant search for freedom in this country. So the stars being a guide toward freedom. Yeah.
Is there any other questions from our audience members? As you were explaining that, it just goes to show how much of, I always wish I could write, I always wanted to have more skills in the writing department, but just how much thought goes into everything that you put in the book. Just hearing the explanation of just how you even decided, what you want it for there. There's so much thought and effort and a whole process. And it's really amazing it really is a work of art as it all comes together. And you have so much passion, even like you said, just discussing your book. What next? I mean, are you done with this topic area? Is there another area you'd like to focus on? Is there more to this?
My writing palette is really vast, and I think people will be surprised by how different the next project is from this. But I do intend to revisit this world from a different angle. But yeah, this world, yes, I do. But I never give specifics.
But we will be seeing something else from you.
Yes. Hopefully.
As we wrap up, I'm going to ask the audience one more time. Any other questions before I ask my final question? We do? Oh, yes.
Sorry, it's me.
Go ahead.
No, how do you sorry. It just picks up in the recording. Oh, gotcha. Go ahead. Thanks. How do you weave theology into fiction? Theology is something that's kind of a separate concept for me, so I'm really curious as I start to read this, how you thought about that, interweaving those two ideas.
In my reading of fiction, a lot of my favorite writers tend to evoke religious themes. It was something I had convinced myself you couldn't do. But how do you read Dostoevsky? How do you read Tolstoy and not see the overt Christian themes there? I think you can do it and it can still be really good. How do I weave theology into temple folk? I don't know that I do, because I don't have, unlike those writers, there's a really strong moralistic, in some of that work, at least I'm reading a lot of Tolstoy these days, and there's a strong moralistic message at the core of a lot of his short fiction that requires this Christian theology. And I don't think that I approach the theological discussion that way. I want the writer to walk away from the work knowing that I am competent in understanding the various ways that theology impacts the world and the pressures it places on my characters when they are approaching a point of decision. But I have no intention of trying to persuade anyone toward any belief system. And that's the interesting thing that I have. I sometimes get questions about this, and I'm like, I don't know how people can see this as a pro-faith book, a book that it's I hope a loving portrait of a community, and so I'm not maligning faith, but I don't see myself as trying to compel anybody toward any belief system. These are characters who are confronting their faith and deciding how they want to relate to religion as an idea altogether. Yeah.
Go ahead, Paul.
I think you can hear. You mentioned a little bit in the afternoon, I'd like to develop it a little more, the connection between that iteration, 1960s, 70s, Malcolm X of Nation of Islam, and hip-hop, and the development of hip-hop. I'd like to, because I don't understand the connection. I know we're celebrating the 50th anniversary the last year, but what was the connection? How are those intertwined?
Thank you so much for saying that, because we live, I feel you were talking about the positive reception of the book, and I have been fielding a lot of mixed responses toward the book, and those responses baffle me somewhat. In part, I understand them because, again, in my concept, this is the first work of literary fiction to seriously delve into this community. But some of the criticism baffles me because I feel that the world of temple folk provides the intellectual foundation of hip-hop culture. And hip-hop is the most consumed, most popular genre of music in our world. And I don't quite understand how people can look askance at the temple folk but nod their heads to half of the hip-hop, decent hip-hop in our culture. And this is the exercise that I put people through. Who's your favorite rapper? Their favorite rapper is probably connected to this world, or at least heavily influenced by the world of temple folk. How that happens? I think we have a protest tradition that dies out in the 70s and comes back to life through hip-hop. And so the posture, the critical stance that we see in a lot of early hip-hop music, there's a direct line between that and the rhetoric of Malcolm X. There are other people who can articulate it so much more clearly than I can, but there's a direct connection. And it's the longing of this young generation to recapitulate those themes in their own way that gives us this vibrant musical tradition. Yeah, I feel like I still have to make the case for a temple folk, like we live with this music and we listen to people talk about this world in hip-hop lyrics, but the book, like why would it be so controversial? It's just fiction, I hope that answers your question.
Anyone else? Oh, yep.
You mentioned being self-taught and how you developed, and I was so happy to hear you talk about like a week and a half for due north, but long time. 2 years. 2 years, okay. Thank you. So can you just like walk through one of these moments where you could really feel like all of a sudden this story is working, this piece of the story, okay, I'm getting this literary man down, or what was, because I love Due North, what magic worked in that?
Can I tell you the Due North story?
Yeah.
It's a story. Okay, so I had this rudimentary idea, oh God, I don't want to ruin it for you, that I wanted to have a brother and a sister confronting the life of a parent who died. So the parents died, and there's this rapprochement between a brother and a sister, sort of debating the life and talking about the deceased parent. That was the original idea. Added to that, this is like my academic background coming in, I knew I wanted to tell a story that could summarize this transition that this movement sort of encapsulates, which is African Americans moving out of the Protestant church into the nation and then into Sunni Islam. Okay, so those are the two ideas operating, the story element, brother, sister, father died. Then there's the history, moving through Christianity to Sunni Islam. Okay, those are the two working pieces that I have thus far. The imagination is filling itself out, but there's something fundamental. I hope this isn't boring you. There's something that, it's still flat, you know? It's not three-dimensional, and when I have a character, they start breathing. I see them, but when it's in that form, they're stick figures. And so I was working so hard, and most of it's mental, like I don't take notes. Everything is happening here. The first draft is the last draft for me. And I remember one day I was listening to some music, specifically Music Soul Child, So Beautiful. Actually, no. I wanted to hear that song. I craved it so bad. And I told myself, no. You may not listen to that song until you've written this story. I will not allow you to enjoy that song. And so the writing was a week and a half, but the filling out of the world took like 6 months. And so for 6 months, I went without listening to this song. And then I got it. I realized Takwa, the main character of Due North, didn't have an interesting dilemma. And I said, this is a very practicing, super adherent Muslim girl, but how does love factor into her life? And when I understood that aspect of her life wasn't filled out, I got it. I sat down to write, and it was done in a week and a half. It was sunset when I finished, and I wrote the word. I knew Polaris was going to be the last word. This was one of those elements I had at the very beginning of the process. I knew the last word of the story was going to be Polaris. I didn't know how I was going to get there, but that was going to be the last word. The sun was setting. I wrote Polaris. I closed my laptop, and I played Music Soul Child, So Beautiful, and I danced by myself as the sun was setting in my living room, and Temple Folk was done. Yes.
I can't even ask a question now, because that was like the best way to wrap this up. The passion, the excitement, I'm really just so happy for you that you've written this book. I mean, it just, as you talk about it, as you describe it, the whole process, it just seems to be something that you enjoy so much. And I want to congratulate you just for putting this together and for being a voice, putting this out in the world, and for really enjoying the process and being so proud of this, because it really is something, a work that is going to, is making an impact, will continue to make an impact for years to come. And can we just give a round of applause?